What happens when a proud soldier discovers that surrender, not victory, is the doorway into the heart of God alone? Welcome, dear friends, to Saint Lives. Wherever you are listening tonight, in a home or on a road, thank you for joining me. Please subscribe and let us begin together. This is the life of Ignatius of Loyola, a Basque warrior whose broken leg became a holy fracture, leading him through pain, doubt, and Mary's gentle guidance to found the Jesuits and teach the Church how to discern spirits again. Since every journey begins before a person knows it has begun, we start where Ignatius first learned to dream, in a rugged corner of the Basque country, where stone towers held old loyalties and the wind seemed to speak of endurance. He was born Inigo Lopez de Loyola in the closing years of the 15th century, the youngest among many children of a minor noble line whose name carried honor but not great riches. The family house at Loyola was half home and half fortress, set among green hills and quick rivers, and shaped by the memory of older wars and older vows. Inigo entered a world that prized faith and fierceness together, where the crucifix hung near the sword, and where a boy was taught early that life was a matter of loyalty, reputation, and courage. His father, Beltran, carried the dignity of a local lord, and his mother, Marina, kept a quiet piety that marked the household with the rhythms of the Church. Yet Inigo's earliest years were not wrapped in softness. He was still young when his mother died, and the loss left a shadow that he did not know how to name. He grew under the care of older siblings and relatives, learning to stand tall among people known for standing their ground. There were prayers in the chapel and feast days with music and processions, but there was also the sturdy Basque habit of holding emotion tightly behind a composed face. Inigo learned to ride, to handle weapons, to listen to the stories of ancestors who had defended their land, and to feel that his blood called him toward something splendid and demanding. In a family of many sons, the elder brothers would inherit the estates, and the younger ones were expected to carve a path elsewhere, often at court or in the army. From the beginning, then, a quiet restlessness rose in him, a desire to prove himself beyond the hills that raised him. When he was still young, perhaps in his early teens, he was sent to serve in the household of Juan Velázquez de Cuellar, a powerful official tied to the royal court of Castile. It was a common road for a younger son without land, and for Inigo it felt like the opening of a gate into the world he had imagined. The court was not only a place where rulers decided the fate of kingdoms, it was also a school of manner, ambition, and shining appearances. Inigo learned how to dress with elegance, how to stand with confidence before great men, and how to speak in a way that made others listen. He watched the rise and fall of favor, the delicate dance of alliances, the way a smile could win more than a sword. And, like a young man hungry for significance, he began to care intensely about how he was seen. The stories that fed his imagination were not yet the lives of saints, but the romances of chivalry that flowed through Europe like a sweet and dangerous wine. Their pages were full of knights who fought for honor and for a lady's admiration, men who crossed mountains to win a name that time could not erase. Inigo read and listened until these dreams felt like a map for his own future. He imagined himself clad in armor, stepping into danger as if danger were an old companion, returning with wounds that would be admired as proof of greatness. In this early period, his faith remained real because he had never known a world without it, but it was not yet the center of his heart. It was a lamp in the room, not the fire in the hearth. He attended Mass, he honored the feasts, He carried a natural reverence for the Virgin Mary learned from home. Yet the deepest hunger inside him was for heroism, as the world defined it. He wanted to be brilliant, bold, and unforgettable, a man whose name would be spoken with admiration long after he left a room. The courtly world rewarded such desire, at least for a time. Inigo grew into a strong and lively young man, with a generous charm that drew companions easily. Those around him noted his confidence, his quick intelligence, and his appetite for risk. He could be courteous and magnetic, and he enjoyed laughter and celebration. But he was also a man who guarded his pride fiercely. In the culture of his age, honor was as solid as stone and as fragile as glass, and a slight could not be ignored. Inigo did not always step away from rivalry, and old accounts hint at brawls and incidents that show a temper ready to flare when his reputation felt threatened. It is important to see him clearly here, not as a villain waiting for grace, but as a young nobleman shaped by his era, swept up in its ideals. He was brave, but his bravery served his image. He was generous, but he loved to be noticed for it. He was not yet divided against himself, because he had not yet learned to ask whether the path he was on led to true peace. Still, even in these early years, quiet threads of grace were already being woven through his life. The court he admired was unstable, and he saw that prestige could vanish overnight. Patrons died, political winds shifted, and a proud man could find himself suddenly useless. Inigo learned, though he did not yet say it aloud, that worldly foundations were never as firm as they appeared. He also carried within him memories of home, the firmness of Basque faith, the smell of candle wax in the little chapel, his mother's long-gone presence, and the simple trust with which his people honored Mary. Some part of his heart, perhaps still tender from early loss, was capable of deep loyalty, even if he aimed that loyalty first at human glories. As the years moved on, Inigo's restlessness drew him toward the military road that suited both his temperament and his dreams. Spain in that era was a land of expanding horizons and hard conflicts, and to be a soldier was to stand where history was being written. War promised what courtly service could not guarantee, a stage wide enough for heroism. He entered the service of Antonio Manrique de Lara, the Duke of Najera, who was a major figure in the Kingdom of Navarre, and there Inigo found a world that matched the romances in his head. The army required discipline, courage, endurance, and fierce loyalty to leaders. It offered the possibility of rising through daring and of winning a name that would travel farther than a court rumor. He took pride in his skill and his boldness. He admired fine armor, graceful weapons, and the careful art of appearing fearless, even when fear might be near. There is something almost tender about how completely he gave himself to this path. He was like a man who believes he has finally found the shape of his life. For him, to serve in battle was not only duty, it was the fulfillment of a personal myth. This is why the later conversion will matter so much. Inigo did not drift into holiness because he was weak or weary. He would be converted because God met him in the very strength he cherished and redirected it. Yet we are not there yet. In this first part, he is still a man of ambition, and ambition can look like light until it begins to burn. There is no sign yet, on the surface, that his road will break in two. Instead, we see him growing more certain of himself, more skilled at winning admiration, more committed to the idea that his future will be a steady upward climb. The young Basque soldier is confident that his story is being written by his own will. But beneath the armor of certainty, there is already an interior space that has not been satisfied. The imagination that feeds on heroic tales is also an imagination that longs for meaning. The heart that wants glory is also a heart that wants to be fully alive. God often begins his work in such hidden places, not by crushing desire, but by letting it grow until it can no longer be fulfilled by small things. So quietly, without Inigo understanding it, the stage is being set. The castle of Loyola, the court of Castile, the disciplined life of the army, the thrill of admiration, the ache of loss that never fully healed, all of these are forming a man who will one day fight a different war. For now he walks forward with a straight posture and a bright ambition, certain that the world is wide enough for his dreams, and that his own courage will carry him wherever he wishes to go. And so the young man stepped forward into the world certain of who he was, not yet knowing who he would become. From those first dreams, his steps carried him into the glittering world he believed was made for him, and the boy from Loyola began to harden into the man called Inigo, the soldier, a figure shaped by courts and camps alike. The years after his leaving home were not a simple march upward, but they felt that way to him, because every new scene seemed to offer a broader stage for the kind of greatness he sought. He was living in a Spain that had learned to think of itself as rising toward something immense. The crowns of Castile and Aragon had been united, the last Moorish kingdom had fallen, and the air was thick with confidence, expansion, and the language of conquest. The same ambition that carried ships across unknown seas carried young nobles to battlefields and palaces, each chasing a version of glory that promised to outlast death. Inigo carried that spirit in his chest as naturally as breath. He was not a man who wanted to pass quietly through life. He wanted to be seen, remembered, and spoken of with admiration, and he learned quickly that the world rewarded those who knew how to present themselves as worthy of attention. He polished his skills as carefully as he polished his armor. He learned the art of appearing fearless, even when fear might flicker near the edge of things. He learned how to read the moods of leaders and companions, how to gain trust, how to hold a room with charm, and how to wrap pride in an elegant smile. To those around him he could seem like the very image of a rising knight, bold, witty, and full of energy, a man fashioned for the bright center of any gathering. He enjoyed the pleasures that came with such a life. There were feasts, music, and nights that blurred into dawn with laughter and wine. There were tournaments and games that tested grace and strength. There were friendships forged in swagger and shared risk. Inigo's temperament leaned toward intensity, and he gave himself to everything with a whole heart, whether it was celebration, rivalry, or service to a patron. If he loved with fire. If he competed as if honor itself were at stake. If he was praised, he drank it in like water in a dry land, because admiration felt like proof that his life was moving toward its rightful peak. It is not hard to imagine him in those years, tall and well-dressed, delighted by fine horses and fine weapons, quick to laugh, quick to challenge, quick to feel the thrill of being at the center of attention. He was handsome enough and confident enough to believe that any door could open if he knocked with the right force. Yet the same fire that made him attractive also made him restless. Inigo was consistent in one thing above all, the refusal to be ordinary. That refusal could become a kind of cruelty toward himself and others, because the world has many ways of reminding a man that he is not as large as his dreams. When he met such reminders, he did not fold. He pushed harder. He placed his reputation above comfort, and sometimes above prudence. The culture of honor in which he lived did not invite reflection on whether a slight was worth answering. If a man's dignity was questioned, he was expected to respond, and Inigo's blood was hot enough to respond quickly. Old records speak of incidents where he was involved in disputes, perhaps even violence, that required the intervention of authorities. In those moments, we see the early shape of a spiritual battle he has not yet named, the pull between pride and humility, between the desire to dominate and the call to serve. But in this season of his life, pride still felt like virtue, and dominance still looked like strength. The truth had not yet turned toward him. The soldier's road soon widened before him. Inigo entered the service of the Duke of Najera, and with that service came the hard rhythm of military life, training, camp discipline, and the constant readiness to move wherever command required. He enjoyed it. His body was strong and his mind quick, and he found pleasure in the frank clarity of the army, where courage was measured in action, not in whispered rumor. The army also rewarded daring, and he was daring by nature. He understood tactics, but he also understood the theater of war, the way a bold stand could influence morale and memory. Inigo wanted not only to win, but to be known for winning. He fashioned himself as a knight in the old romantic sense, even as warfare itself was changing, becoming less chivalric and more brutal, less about single combat and more about cannon and siege. Still, he clung to the noble dream, because it allowed him to see his life as a story of honor rather than of mere survival. In his imagination, there was always a lady somewhere who might admire his courage, a courtly audience that might one day hear his name, a future in which he would stand among the celebrated figures of his land. His inner life was filled with scenes of triumph and admiration, and when he laid down at night, it was often those visions that carried him into sleep. Yet something curious was happening beneath the surface. The more he fed these fantasies, the more they demanded. A small victory was not enough. It needed to be larger. A compliment was sweet, but it needed to be repeated, and by someone more important. A comfortable position felt satisfying for a moment, but quickly began to feel like a cage. His ambitions were like a fire that grew by consuming, and so he began to lean toward risk not only for duty, but for reputation, toward boldness not only for strategy, but for self. Even his virtues were shaded with vanity. His generosity wanted applause. His courage wanted an audience. His loyalty wanted to be noticed. This is not said to condemn him, but to show him as human, a man who had not yet learned that the heart is not satisfied by being seen, but by being loved in truth. The Lord was already present in his life, as he is in every life. But Inigo had not yet turned his face fully toward that presence. He still carried the habits of faith learned in childhood. He knew the prayers and feast days. He respected priests and churches. He might kneel before Mary's image with the natural reverence of his people. But faith was not yet the shaping center of his identity. It was part of the world he inhabited, not the world that inhabited him. His deepest guiding star was still his own future, his own myth, his own rising name. There is a quiet sadness in that, though he would not have recognized it. To live for an image is to live slightly outside one's own life, always measuring the present moment by how well it serves the story you want to tell about yourself. Inigo was not yet trapped in despair, because youth protects us with its energy, but he was already practicing the kind of interior striving that, without grace, can become tyranny. We might say gently that his heart was training for something it did not yet understand. The discipline he loved in war would one day serve prayer. The endurance he cultivated in hardship would one day hold him steady in spiritual trial. The desire for greatness would one day be purified into a desire for God's greater glory. But before such purification, The soul often passes through a narrowing place. God does not always remove a person's strength. Sometimes he allows it to reach its limit, so that the person can see where strength alone cannot go. Inigo was nearing such a limit, though he felt only the thrill of movement toward his dreams. Events in Navarre drew him toward the city of Pamplona, where French forces threatened to take ground and where Spanish commanders prepared to resist. The moods of Europe were tense, alliances shifting, borders restless, and Inigo found himself in the center of a struggle that felt like history itself. He was hungry for a chance to prove his worth, to stand in a moment that others would speak of later. The fortress at Pamplona would offer him exactly what he believed he wanted: a test of courage against overwhelming odds. In the days before the siege, he would have looked like the man he always imagined he would become: confident, decisive, eager for battle, perhaps even a little impatient with those who counseled retreat. His pride did not fear danger. In a strange way, danger was what made his life feel real. He did not yet know that the danger ahead would not only be outside him. He thought he was stepping toward glory, moving deeper into the story he had chosen. And so in that bright certainty, he took his place among the defenders, believing that if he stood firm enough, the world would at last give him the name he had been chasing since boyhood. Even in triumph, there was a hidden hunger still unsatisfied, waiting for a crack in the armor. The craving for glory soon led him to the battlefield, where fate would speak in iron and fire, and Pamplona became the place where the story Inigo had written for himself would be interrupted by a sentence from God that he could not yet read. The spring of 1521 was restless in Navarre. French troops had crossed into the region, laying claim to the city and its stronghold, and the Spanish garrison found itself outnumbered, uncertain, and pressed by commanders who argued over whether resistance was even possible. Many thought surrender was the sensible path. The walls were old, the cannons of the French were heavy, and the defenders were too few. But Inigo was not a man who could bear the thought of yielding while breath still remained in him. He had been raised where honor was sacred, and he had trained his whole heart to see daring resistance as the highest form of life. When he spoke, he did not speak like a cautious officer working through numbers. He spoke like a knight in one of his beloved romances, insisting that courage itself could change the shape of events. He urged the commanders to hold the fortress, to defy the odds, to show the enemy that Spanish ground was not taken without a price. His confidence did not come from strategy alone. It came from the identity he had built for years, a man destined to stand firm when others faltered. In those hours he was almost radiant with purpose. He was not praying for God's will, because he believed he already knew what a noble man must do. He saw his life as a straight line toward renown, and Pamplona was the point where the line could rise sharply upward. The siege began with the kind of tension that makes time feel thick. The French artillery was set. The city trembled under the first blows, and the Spanish defenders watched the horizon for smoke and movement. Inside the fortress there was a mixture of fear and stubbornness, of men whispering about the futility of resistance, and men clinging to the hope that reinforcements might arrive. Inigo moved among them with a steady vigor, encouraging, commanding, and at times rebuking those who spoke of surrender. He was not blinded to danger. He could see the cannons, he could hear the walls crack. But danger felt to him like a bright wind that proved his courage real. He took his position on the ramparts where the fighting would be thickest, because he wanted his own eyes to meet the enemy and his own body to bear the risk. For him, a battle was not only an event, it was a judgment on who he was. If he fought boldly, he would be bold. If he wavered, he would become small in his own memory. The bombardment grew heavier. Stones shook loose. Smoke drifted low over the city. The air was filled with dust and the raw smell of iron. The defenders answered with their own fire, but they were steadily pressed, and still the message of surrender was offered to them. Inigo rejected it. He had the fierce pride of a man who measures his worth by what he can endure, and he endured the siege as if it were the very reason he had been born. Some later voices would call him reckless, and perhaps he was, but his recklessness was the recklessness of someone who loved honor more than comfort, and who could not imagine any life that did not rise toward greatness. It is strange and sobering to think how much of a person's future can depend on one moment like this, on a choice to remain on a wall rather than withdraw to safety. Yet God often meets us in the places we choose with confidence, not to shame us, but to redirect us. On the morning when the cannonball came, the fighting had reached its hardest edge. Inigo was still on the wall. He was standing near a gun emplacement, surveying the enemy's line, urging men to hold their stations. The French batteries were set on the hills outside and fired in steady rhythm. Each shot was a terrible arc of force, black stone and metal crossing the sky with a sound that seemed to tear the air. One of those shots found the space where Inigo stood. The cannonball struck the wall and burst through with a violence so sudden that the world must have seemed to crack open. It tore into his legs, shattering one and badly wounding the other. In an instant, the strong soldier was thrown down, the proud heart pinned inside a broken body. The pain was blinding, immediate, and total. The body that had carried him in confidence now refused to obey him. He could not stand. He could not run. He could not even shift away from the ruin beneath him. He lay where he fell, blood soaking his clothes, dust in his mouth, smoke in his lungs. The roar of battle pressed around him like a storm. The men near him rushed to lift him, and as they did, the defenders saw what his wound meant. The sight of their boldest voice broken on the wall did more than any argument could do. It drained their courage. If Inigo, who had seemed untouchable, was brought down by one shot, how could the fortress withstand what was coming? The garrison surrendered soon after. It was a bitter surrender, and for Inigo it must have felt doubly bitter, because the battle ended not with a heroic stand, but with his sudden removal from it. He had not been carried out in triumph, but in helplessness. The fortress he had insisted on defending was lost. The story he had imagined for himself was halted mid-sentence. He was taken off the field, carried through the city and toward the long road of recovery, while his mind still echoed with the shock of what had happened. The French, impressed by his courage, allowed him respectful treatment, and Spanish companions brought him back toward Loyola. Yet respect could not soften what he felt inside. The wound was not only in his body, it was in his identity. For a man who had built himself around activity, bravery, and visible strength, the sudden inability to stand was like being exiled from himself. The journey home was slow. Each jolt of the stretcher was a fresh wave of pain. The road that once would have felt like a path toward glory now felt like a retreat into obscurity. When he arrived at the family house, the surgeons examined his leg and found the bones broken badly, twisted in a way that would not heal cleanly. They set it as best they could, but it healed crooked. Inigo, still clinging to the old world of appearances, could not bear the thought of being visibly deformed. A crooked leg might limit his military future and his courtly charm. So he demanded another operation, one that would re-break the bone and reset it. The procedure was brutal. There was no true anesthesia, only the raw endurance of a man biting down on agony. The surgeons sawed and pulled, and he endured the pain as if it were another battlefield, refusing to cry out because even in suffering he wanted to remain a man of honor. It is easy to admire that endurance, but it also reveals something sorrowful. He was still trying to win by willpower alone. He was still trying to shape his life by force. Even his pain became another place where he would prove himself stronger than others. Yet pain has a way of teaching lessons that pride cannot anticipate. The weeks turned into months. Fevers came. There were nights when he thought he might die. The body he had trusted was now a fragile thing, dependent on others for movement, dependent on time for healing, dependent on mercy for survival. There is a kind of silence that surrounds a wounded person, a silence that strips away the noise that once made life feel meaningful. Inigo entered that silence without wanting to. He had no choice. The season of battle was over, and the season of stillness had begun. At first he filled his mind with old fantasies. He asked for the books of chivalry that had always fed his spirit. He wanted to escape into the familiar world where heroes rose through bold deeds, because he could not yet accept that his own bold deeds had ended on a wall in Pamplona. But the household had no such books. Instead, they gave him what was available: a life of Christ and a collection of stories about the saints. He opened them reluctantly at first, as someone might open a window only because there is nothing else to do, not yet realizing that the air coming in will change him. For now, he was still a soldier laid low, waiting for his body to knit, and feeling for the first time the terrifying question of what remains when the future you worship has been taken away. Lying broken in silence, he began to face a question he had never asked before. Who am I when I can no longer win? That unanswered question followed him into the slow days of healing, days that felt at first like a narrow hallway with no doors, for a man who had lived as if every day were an open field. The castle at Loyola, once the background of his childhood, became now the boundaries of his world. Outside the windows, the Basque hills continued their patient greening. The river kept moving over stones, and the seasons turned without asking his permission. Inside, Inigo lay stretched on a bed that was not a place of rest, but a kind of forced exile. His leg throbbed with a deep, stubborn pain that rose and fell like a tide. The surgeries had left him weaker than he wanted anyone to see. His body was thin from fever and long immobility, and even small movements exhausted him. He had been a man who measured life by forward motion, by the readiness to leap onto a horse or into a fight, and now the simple act of sitting up felt like climbing a mountain. In the first weeks he fought this helplessness the way he had fought enemies, with grit, impatience, and a refusal to accept limits. He ordered, insisted, arranged, and tried to will his body into obedience. But bodies do not heal on command. They heal in their own quiet time, and so his pride had no battlefield where it could win. It only had a bed and an hourglass and the slow hum of pain. Boredom joined pain as another wound. The days were long, and his thoughts had nowhere to go but in circles. He tried to keep his mind in the world he had lost, replaying the siege of Pamplona, imagining how things might have been different, picturing himself again as a knight whose courage would be celebrated. There were long stretches when these fantasies were not only comfort, but survival. They let him forget the smell of medicine, the stiffness of his limbs, the humiliating dependence on servants and siblings. They also let him preserve the image he held dearest, the image of himself as a man destined for greatness. So he asked for the romances of chivalry he had loved since youth, the tales of heroes with shining armor and ladies with approving eyes. He wanted to feed again on that sweet fire. But the household did not have these books. Perhaps it was a small providence, perhaps only a practical accident. But in that scarcity, a door opened. What they could find for him were devotional books, the life of Christ, and a larger collection of the lives of saints. At first he accepted them with the resignation of someone given plain bread when he had wanted wine. He read because there was nothing else to do, because the mind left idle is a mind that can sink into despair, and because even a proud soldier knows the need to occupy the hours. The words met him quietly. There was no thunder, no sudden conversion, no dramatic burst of tears. The life of Christ was not written like a romance. It had no glitter. It moved slowly through villages and deserts, through prayers in the night, through healings done without fanfare, through a love that did not demand applause. Still, something in it held him. He lingered over the patience of Jesus, the way he met people whose lives were tangled and poor, and the way he walked toward suffering as if suffering were not defeat, but obedience. He read of Christ's humility, his hidden years, his gentle firmness with those who were proud, his closeness with the Father, and an unsettling contrast began to rise inside Inigo. The Christ he was meeting on the page did not resemble the kind of hero he had tried to become. This hero did not conquer by force, but by surrender. He did not seek a name, but accepted obscurity. He did not protect his ego, but gave his life. Inigo did not yet understand what to do with that contrast, but it pressed on him like a quiet hand. Then he turned to the stories of the saints. Here at last there was something closer to the heroic tone he knew. Lives of people who had fought great battles of faith and endured trials with courage that looked, at least from a distance, like the courage of war. He read of Francis who left wealth to embrace poverty, of Dominic who traveled and preached, of Augustine who had been restless and then found his rest in God, of saints who had chosen hardship for love, not for applause. He read of their penances, their pilgrimages, their boldness in speaking truth, their willingness to be considered fools for Christ. These stories lit a new kind of imagination in him. When he finished a chapter, he would close his eyes and picture himself doing what they had done. He imagined leaving home as a pilgrim rather than a courtier. He imagined living in poverty, sleeping on the ground, fasting, serving the sick, giving everything away. For moments, these visions thrilled him the way battle dreams had once thrilled him. He felt a surge of desire that was strangely clean, as if it did not leave behind the aftertaste of vanity. And yet the old visions did not vanish. They returned as soon as he drifted, painting again the world of courtly victory, the admiration of a great lady, the elegance of public honor. His mind became a field where two armies marched in turn. What he noticed, slowly and without yet naming it, was that the two kinds of daydreams left different footprints in his heart. When he imagined the old life, he felt excited while the fantasy lasted, but afterward he was dry, restless, and a little empty. When he imagined the saints and their way of Christ, he felt peaceful afterward, even if the thought involved hardship. It was as if one vision was sugar and the other bread. One gave quick pleasure and then craving. The other gave quiet nourishment. Inigo did not have the vocabulary to call this discernment yet, but grace was already teaching him by experience. The wounded bed became a classroom. The pain became a kind of tutor. The boredom, so humiliating at first, became space where a new interior world could speak. He began to sense that the heart has its own weather, and that God may be found not only in church, but in the way certain thoughts bring light, while others bring darkness. In the middle of all this, his physical suffering was still real. There were nights when the leg burned so fiercely he could not sleep. There were mornings when his whole body felt heavy with weakness, and he wondered if he would ever walk without limping. Yet even those fears began to shift. The more he read, the more he noticed that Christ and the saints did not run from weakness. They entered it. They accepted it. They even offered it. That scared him. His whole life had been built on avoiding weakness, covering it, reshaping it, defeating it. But now he was being shown another possibility, that weakness might be a road rather than a wall, that suffering might contain a hidden invitation. He did not fall into sweetness about it. He still resented the pain. He still wished his body would hurry. But he began to consider, almost against his will, that his shattered leg might not be the end of his story. It might be the hinge. Sometimes he would put the book down and stare out the window, letting the wind cool his thoughts. The Basque hills seemed the same as always, but he was not the same. There were moments of deep longing that came without warning, a longing to do something great for God, as he had once longed to do something great for himself. There were also moments of fear, because a new desire means a new loss, and he did not yet know if he was ready to lose the world he had loved. Yet every day, the old world felt slightly less convincing. Every day, the new world felt slightly more real. In a gentle way, almost like a tide that rises while one is not looking, grace was turning him. The man who had once chased admiration began, slowly, to feel a strange admiration for holiness. The soldier who had once rehearsed battles for fame began to rehearse battles for Christ. And in that slow rehearsal, his heart began to be rebuilt. Something gentle had begun to wake in him, like dawn in a room long closed. The dawn grew brighter day by day as his heart listened more carefully, and the room where he lay, once a prison of pain and impatience, began to feel like a quiet chapel where God was speaking in a language he had never learned before. Inigo did not wake one morning suddenly perfect or serene. His change was more like a slow turning of the soil. Some days the old dreams still returned with their familiar sweetness. He would picture himself riding again among nobles, his limp hidden under the dignity of armor, his courage praised by those whose approval had once felt like life itself. He would imagine the gaze of a great lady resting on him with admiration, the way the romances had trained him to imagine love, not as sacrifice, but as triumph. These scenes could still stir his blood, because they were not only fantasies, but fragments of his identity. Yet now, when he let them run their course, he noticed again the dryness afterward, the faint disappointment that lingered like dust in the mouth. It was not merely that the dreams were impossible now. It was that they felt smaller than they once had. They fit his old self, but they did not fill the new space opening inside him. Then, as if to balance them, other scenes would rise, often in the quiet of late night or early dawn when the castle was still. He would imagine Francis of Assisi leaving his silks, walking barefoot toward Christ, smiling at poverty as if it were a bride. He would imagine Dominic preaching under the open sky, tired, hungry, yet on fire with joy. He would imagine the apostles stepping into unknown roads simply because Christ had called them. These visions were strange to him, yet they carried a peace that the old romances never brought. When he finished imagining them, he did not feel restless. He felt settled, and so, without any teacher but the movements of his own heart, he began to learn that not all desires are the same, that some lead toward God and others lead away, even when both seem bright at first. This inner noticing was the seed of what would later become his great gift to the Church, discernment of spirits. But for now it was simply a wounded man learning to read his own soul. His physical recovery continued, though slowly. The leg healed, but it healed imperfectly. He could stand again, but the limp remained, a visible reminder that the body he had once trusted was now marked for life. He tested his strength by walking short distances in the halls, leaning on a staff, then resting. Each step brought both gratitude and humiliation. Gratitude because he could move at all, humiliation because movement had once been effortless, and now it was measured. Yet even this humiliation became part of his interior work. He began to see, through the light of what he was reading, that a man's worth is not found in how smoothly he walks through the world, but in how truly he walks toward God. Still, the struggle was real. Vanity doesn't die easily. He could accept the limp as a fact, but there were moments when he hated it, not only for what it cost him in comfort, but for what it cost him in image. He had always wanted to be impressive. Now God was asking him to be real. The question that had begun to form in him grew sharper. What should he do with this life that had been interrupted? It was one thing to admire Christ and the saints in a bed of forced stillness. It was another to choose their road when the door of action opened again. The old self whispered that he could still be someone significant in the world, perhaps not in battle now, but in courtly service or some other noble path. The new desire whispered another invitation, to leave everything and become a pilgrim, to live for Christ alone, to imitate the saints not in imagination, but in flesh. He wrestled with these voices not in one dramatic night, but over many days, sometimes leaning toward one, sometimes toward the other, feeling at times a sincere longing to be holy, and at times a fear of being forgotten. The interior battle was quiet, but it was fierce. As he watched himself, he began to understand that conversion is not simply choosing a new set of actions. It is allowing God to remake the center around which every action turns. In this season, his prayers deepened. At first, he prayed as he always had, repeating familiar words and devotions learned in childhood. But now prayer began to feel less like duty and more like conversation. He would ask Christ for light. He would speak to the Virgin Mary with the simple trust of a son whose mother is close, even after death. When he imagined a pilgrim life, it was often Mary he pictured first, not as a distant figure in a painting, but as a living mother who tenderly receives a broken soldier. He felt drawn to offer himself to her protection, as knights once offered themselves to a lady, but now with a purer love that did not seek admiration in return. He began to say, in his own way, that if his life was to be remade, it should be remade in her Son. The rosary, which had once been a habit, became a comfort. The cross, which had once been a symbol he honored in passing, became a door he wanted to enter. He did not yet know how far that door would lead, but he sensed that Christ was calling him beyond the shallow heroism of pride into the deeper heroism of surrender. He also began to examine his past with a new honesty. Before, his memories had been like trophies, scenes of skill, charm, and daring that he replayed with satisfaction. Now, under the gaze of Christ's humility, he could see other things too: his vanity, his quick temper, the times he had placed his honor above charity, the selfishness hidden inside some of his best deeds. This seeing did not crush him. It humbled him. It made him understand that holiness is not an ornament added to a proud man. It is a new heart placed where pride once ruled. He felt sorrow for his sins, not only because they were sins, but because they had shaped him into someone smaller than he was meant to be. And with sorrow came a desire to confess, not lightly, but completely, to clean the room of his soul so that God could dwell there without clutter. He began to prepare for a great general confession, one that would include his whole life, a kind of spiritual laying down of arms. Even before he left the castle, this intention was already forming, like a vow whispered in secret. Little by little, his decision settled. The peace that came after imagining the saints began to feel like a sign. The restlessness that followed worldly fantasies began to feel like a warning. He did not yet have a director to guide him, but he trusted the way God was teaching him from within. He resolved to become a pilgrim to the Holy Land, to walk where Christ had walked, and to live the rest of his life in service of God. The decision was not a sudden lightning bolt. It was more like a river finding its course. Once he accepted it, a certain calm entered him. He began to think practically about leaving, about what he would carry, about how he would live simply. He imagined giving away his fine clothes, taking a pilgrim's staff, and letting God provide what he needed on the road. The thought both frightened and freed him. It frightened him because it meant stepping into the unknown without the armor of status. It freed him because, for the first time, his future did not depend on his own performance. It depended on grace. There was still pain in his leg, still weakness in his body, still the old pride flaring now and then, but the direction of his life had changed. When he looked back at Pamplona now, he did not see only loss. He began to see providence. The cannonball that shattered his ambition had also shattered a wall inside him, letting in the possibility of God's greater dream. He would not have chosen such a road, yet here it was, offered to him through suffering. And he began to understand, in a way that was still new and fragile, that God sometimes saves us by breaking the things we were tempted to worship. At last he rose not only from his bed, but from the person he had been. With his body still weak, he began to walk toward a life he could not yet name, and each step away from Loyola felt like a quiet tearing from the old world and a gentle entering into the new. He left the castle not with trumpets, but with a pilgrim's simplicity, carrying little more than a staff, a few necessities, and a heart that was both aflame and unsure. The Basque hills faded behind him as he traveled south toward the great Marian shrine of Montserrat, a place that had long drawn seekers, kings, and the poor alike to the dark wooden image of the Mother who listens. The road itself was a kind of first lesson. He had once traveled as a nobleman, guarded by status, fed by comfort, and certain that the world existed to recognize him. Now he traveled as one among many, a limping man on foot, dependent on the kindness of strangers, exposed to weather and fatigue, learning in his muscles what humility feels like. There were moments when old pride flared, especially when the limp reminded him of what he had lost. Yet the decision he had made at Loyola held him steady. When pride rose, he tried to hand it to Christ. When fear rose, he spoke to Mary. The rhythm of walking became prayer. The sky above him, wide and indifferent, felt also like a shelter. He was beginning to live not by control, but by trust. At last the mountain of Montserrat appeared, a jagged spine rising toward the heavens, and as he approached its steep paths, he felt a quiet trembling. This was not a battlefield where he might win glory by force. It was a sanctuary where surrender itself would be his offering. He reached the monastery in the late winter or early spring of 1522, and the monks received him as they received pilgrims who came to lay down burdens. Inigo went first to confession. The general confession he had prepared in his mind now poured out of him over the course of days, perhaps 3, perhaps more, as he spoke the full story of his life, the pride, the vanity, the sins hidden under charm and courage. He did not confess as a man trying to polish his conscience. He confessed as a man who wanted to be remade. There is something deeply human in that moment, the way a soul aches to be seen truthfully and then forgiven. Inigo, who had once guarded his image like armor, now let the armor fall. He put his past on the altar of mercy. The priest listened, and absolution was given. The burden lifted not by his effort, but by grace. In those hours, Inigo tasted a freedom he had never known before. The freedom of being loved not for what he achieved, but for what God could do in him. After confession, he prepared for an all-night vigil before the Virgin, a gesture that carried the echo of his old chivalry, yet was now purified into worship. He had once dreamed of serving a lady to win her admiration. Now he wanted to serve Mary to belong entirely to her Son. As evening fell, he went to the chapel, and there he did something that would become one of the great turning points of his life. He removed the fine clothes that still marked his noble status and set them aside. He put on the simple garment of a pilgrim, rough and plain. Then he hung his sword and dagger before the altar of Mary, leaving there the instruments of his former identity. It was not theater for others. It was a private, trembling act of surrender. He was telling God with his body what he had already said with his heart, that his war for worldly glory was over, and that any battle left to him would be for Christ. The vigil lasted through the night. The chapel was dim, the air still, and the monks chanting drifted in and out like waves. Inigo prayed, sometimes with words, sometimes in silence, sometimes with tears. He did not try to hide. The hours passed slowly. His leg ached. Sleep tugged at him. Yet he remained, because he wanted this surrender to be complete. In the quiet of that night, he placed himself into Mary's care, asking her to guide him as a mother guides a child who does not yet know the road. He did not ask for visions. He asked for fidelity. He did not promise perfection. He promised to walk. When dawn came, he stepped out of the chapel a different man. The sword at Mary's altar was more than a symbol. It was a threshold. He gave away his fine clothing to a poor man outside the shrine, a gesture that was both generous and risky. In a moment he was stripped of the visible signs of his class. The pilgrim garment he wore was coarse and ill-fitting, and to his old self it might have felt humiliating. Yet now it felt like liberty. He was becoming small so that God could be great in him. From Montserrat he set out toward the nearby town of Manresa, intending to stay only a few days to gather strength before continuing to the Holy Land. He did not yet know that Manresa would become another kind of battlefield, not against armies of flesh, but against the interior storms of his own soul. The walk to Manresa was short in miles, but long in meaning. He entered the town and found shelter near a Dominican convent. There he began to live as a penitent. He begged for food, he prayed for long hours, he served the sick when he could. His heart was sincere, and the fire of conversion was still new enough to feel urgent. He believed that to love God meant to imitate the saints in everything, especially in their penances. So he began to fast rigorously, to keep night vigils, to sleep little, to scourge his body, to wear rough garments that irritated the skin. He treated his body as if it were an enemy to be subdued, and in part this came from love, but in part it also came from that same old intensity that had once driven him in war. He did not yet know how to be gentle with himself. He wanted to conquer holiness the way he had once wanted to conquer fame. He wanted to prove his seriousness by hunger and pain. The limp, the wound, The months of helplessness had not erased his warrior spirit. They had redirected it, but the spirit still sought something to fight. So he fought himself. There were moments in Manresa when this zeal felt bright. He would pray in the chapel and feel a deep sweetness, a sense that God was near and listening. He would serve the poor and feel a quiet joy that had nothing to do with applause. He would gaze at the crucifix and feel that Christ's suffering was not a tragedy, but a love offered. These consolations strengthened him, and they also confirmed his desire to continue as a pilgrim toward Jerusalem. Yet alongside these gifts, another current was beginning to stir. When a person changes direction quickly, the soul often shakes as it tries to settle. Old habits of mind do not disappear at once. Inigo's old pride had found new clothing. It could now whisper that he was becoming a saint by sheer effort, that his penances were making him worthy, that God's favor was something he could earn by intensity. These whispers were subtle. They did not appear as vanity at first. They appeared as devotion, but devotion that is secretly driven by self can become a trap. God would have to teach him a deeper humility still, and that teaching would not come only through sweetness. For now, though, he remained a pilgrim in earnest, one who had laid down his sword and picked up a staff, one who had left behind the old world of court and camp and stepped into a life where every day was a question answered by prayer. In the days after Montserrat, as he walked along the roads near Manresa, he may have felt that his conversion was complete. Yet grace was only beginning to shape him. The soldier had become a seeker, and the road ahead was both empty and full of promise. The promise of the road soon led him into a cave of the soul. For Manresa, which he had imagined as a brief resting place on the way to Jerusalem, became instead the furnace where his young conversion would be tested, purified, and nearly broken. He settled into a life of severe penitence with the wholehearted zeal of a man who had never done anything by halves. The same intensity that once drove him to seek honor on battlefields now drove him to seek holiness by conquering himself. He begged for his food, often taking only what was offered late in the day, and he fasted far beyond what his wounded body could bear. He slept little, choosing the cold floor or a hard bench rather than comfort. He prayed for hours at a time, kneeling until his leg throbbed, because pain still felt to him like the price of sincerity. He scourged himself, wore rough garments, and avoided conversation and distraction. He wanted to be all flame, all offering, all proof that his old life was dead. There was purity in this desire, but there was also a hidden danger. Inigo still carried within him the soldier's habit of believing that victory comes by force, and so he treated grace almost like a fortress to be taken, not a gift to be received. His penances, meant to humble him, sometimes fed a new kind of pride. Not the pride of courtly elegance, but the pride of strictness, the quiet thought that he could make himself holy by sheer endurance. In the beginning, God met his zeal with consolations. Inigo would pray and feel sweetness, a gentle warmth in the heart, as if Christ were close beside him. Sometimes the scriptures opened to him with a clarity he had never known, and he felt a happiness that was simple, clean, and almost childlike. He would walk outside the town and look across the fields and hills, and the world seemed washed with meaning, each blade of grass whispering that God is present. These moments confirmed him. They made him believe he was moving steadily toward sanctity, and towards the Holy Land, where he imagined he would spend the rest of his days in prayer, poverty, and joyful service. But spiritual consolations, especially at the start of a new road, are not always meant to remain. They are often like a lamp carried into a dark passage, enough to keep the traveler walking until the eyes learn to see without it. Inigo's lamp began to dim, and as it dimmed, another inner force rose to meet him. It began quietly, as a tightening of conscience. He had made his general confession at Montserrat, pouring out his whole past and receiving absolution, and he had felt peace afterward. But in Manresa, memories returned like sharp birds in the night. He began to recall sins he feared he had not confessed fully, or sins he had confessed but lacked complete sorrow for, or sins whose smallness now seemed enormous under the light of his new seriousness. At first he returned to confession to settle his mind. Then he returned again, and again, and again. Each time he left the confessional, he felt relief for a moment, but relief quickly slipped away. A new doubt would rise. Had he spoken clearly? Had he forgotten something? Had he offended God without realizing it? Was his repentance sincere enough? The questions multiplied, wrapping around his thoughts like vines. This was not the healthy examination of conscience that leads to humility and trust. It was a scruple, a spiritual anxiety that makes God seem not like a father, but like a judge who can never be satisfied. Inigo did not yet recognize this as temptation. He believed it was holiness. He believed that to be serious about God meant to be tortured by the fear of displeasing him, and so he drove himself harder. Soon his prayer, once sweet, became dry. When he knelt, he felt only darkness. The hours that had once flown with peace now dragged like stones. He forced himself to remain on his knees, to keep going, to do more, because he feared that dryness meant God was angry with him. But the more he pushed with willpower, the more strained his soul became. He began to lose appetite entirely. His body grew thin and fragile, his face hollowed. Sleep, already scarce, became restless, and in the quiet of those exhausted nights, deeper temptations came. He began to wonder whether his whole conversion was an illusion, whether he was unfit for God, whether his sins were too many, whether grace had truly forgiven him. The old pride that once sought admiration now turned into a terrible self-accusation, because pride wounded becomes despair. He felt trapped between a God he longed for and a conscience that would not let him rest. At times the darkness grew so heavy that he was tempted to end his life. The thought did not come as a dramatic wish to die, but as a tired whisper that death would be relief from the endless wrestling. He stood one day by the river and considered throwing himself in, not out of hatred for God, but out of terror that he could never please God. That is one of the most painful paradoxes of scrupulosity. It can make a person so obsessed with holiness that he begins to believe holiness is impossible. Inigo hovered near that precipice, yet even there, grace still worked. A faint thread of reason in him began to question what was happening. Could God, who had drawn him so gently at Loyola, now be leading him into madness? Could the Father of Christ really demand a perfection so crushing that a man would rather die than fail? He began to suspect that another spirit was at work in his interior world, not the Spirit of God, but the spirit of accusation. One day, in the midst of this torment, he made a small but decisive act. He told himself that he would not return to confession repeatedly for the same past sins. He would trust the absolution already given. He would refuse to keep digging up the dead. This was not a triumph of pride. It was a fragile act of obedience to mercy. He also began to notice something else. When the scruples spoke, they always led toward agitation, fear, and hopelessness. When he turned his mind toward Christ's mercy, Even if he felt nothing, there was a quiet settling, a breath of peace. He began to learn, painfully, that the enemy can disguise himself as false holiness, leading a soul not to love but to panic. He also began to learn that God is not honored by despair. God is honored by trust. These lessons did not erase his suffering overnight. The scruples returned many times. The temptations to discouragement still flickered. But a new foundation was forming under him, the foundation of discernment and humility. His penances also began to change. Not because he abandoned them, but because he began to see that to punish the body is not the same as to love God. He saw that harshness could be another way of clinging to control. He started to accept food more regularly. He allowed himself more rest. He spoke to wise priests in the town who counseled him gently to be moderate, to remember that God desires the heart more than the bruised flesh. Inigo listened, though the old soldier in him resisted. He was learning that obedience can be harder than austerity, because obedience requires surrender of one's own idea of holiness. The man who had once wanted to win by daring now had to win by letting God lead, and so the cave of the soul became a teacher. In that deep place, he learned that the spiritual life is not a straight climb of personal effort. It is a path where consolations and desolations alternate, where the heart must learn to recognize which movements come from God and which come from fear, and where the true weapon is not force but faith. By the time this season began to ease, Inigo was humbled in a way that no battlefield could have humbled him. He had been brought to the edge of despair, and there he had found not his own strength, but God's mercy. The old self-reliance had been cracked open. He was still zealous, still intense, still hungry for holiness, but now a gentler wisdom began to settle into him. He learned that peace is not something you seize, it is something you receive. He learned that God is not a taskmaster waiting for a man to collapse. God is a father who lifts a man when he collapses. He learned that suffering can be a school, but only if it leads to love. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the darkness loosened, not because Inigo had conquered it by willpower, but because he had surrendered it to the Lord who does not despise the weak. He learned that holiness is not the crushing of the heart, but its healing. After darkness, the Lord offered him a moment of clear water and clear sight, and the place of that gift was not a throne room or a battlefield, but a quiet stretch of river outside Manresa, where the ordinary world suddenly became transparent to God. Inigo's life in the town had settled into a gentler rhythm. The cruel edge of scruple had softened. He still prayed long hours, still begged, still served the poor, but he was no longer fighting his body as if it were an enemy, nor his conscience as if it were a tyrant. There was a new simplicity in him, fragile yet real, like a wound that has closed but still remembers its tenderness. Even so, he was not living in constant sweetness. He had learned that dryness and consolation come and go like weather, and that fidelity is not measured by feeling, but by love. This knowledge did not make him a master of the spiritual life, but it made him a student who could endure the lessons without running away. He was also beginning, almost without realizing it, to collect the small observations of his interior world, noticing what kinds of thoughts brought peace, what kinds brought agitation, what choices opened him toward God, and what choices folded him inward toward fear or pride. These were seeds. They were being planted in the soil of his suffering, and they would one day flower into the spiritual exercises. Yet for now, they were simply the way a pilgrim learned to walk without falling. It was in this quieter season that the great illumination came. One day, perhaps after prayer, perhaps while walking alone, he made his way out of the town toward the river Cardiner. The landscape around Manresa was modest, fields and low hills, trees moving softly in the wind, the sky broad and pale. Nothing in the outward scene announced what would happen. He sat near the river, and later accounts say he was not doing anything remarkable. He was simply there, resting, looking at the water. Yet the heart that has been stripped by trial often becomes more able to receive what is hidden in plain sight. Inigo later tried to describe what unfolded, though he knew words were too small for it. He did not speak of a vision as in a storybook, with lights and voices floating in the air. He spoke of an understanding, sudden and immense, like a curtain being pulled back inside the mind. As he gazed toward the water, it was as if God opened his inner eyes to see how all things live in him and from him. The mysteries of faith that he had struggled to grasp became clear in a way not learned by reading but given by grace. He understood, in a single quiet gift, more than he had understood in all his past study. He saw the world not as a stage for his own ambition, nor even merely as a place to endure on the way to heaven, but as something held within God's loving presence at every moment. The Trinity, the Incarnation, the way God guides souls, the meaning of Christ's life. These truths seemed to settle into him as if they had always been there, waiting for the right hour to be revealed. He would say later that he felt as if he were a different man afterward. The river had not changed, the trees had not changed, his limp was still there, the town still waited for him to return, but within him something had been widened. It was like stepping out of a narrow room into a vast plain. The desolations that had nearly destroyed him were now seen in a new light. He understood that God had been leading him even through that darkness, not by cruelty, but by a father's medicine, teaching him where to place his trust. He understood that holiness was not achieved by crushing oneself, but by surrendering oneself to love. He understood, in a way that sank deeper than thought, that God desires to deal directly with the soul, not as a distant ruler, but as an intimate guide. And he understood that the heart can discern God's movements, not by constant fear, but by attentive prayer. If his earlier discernment had been like a man learning by stumbling, this illumination was like a lamp placed in his hands. From that point, prayer took on a new shape. He still prayed in the chapel, he still attended Mass, he still confessed and fasted as a penitent, yet now his prayer was marked by clearer interior listening. He began to draw together the methods that had helped him in scruple and consolation, arranging them in a more deliberate way. He learned to meditate on the life of Christ by placing himself within gospel scenes, watching Jesus speak, heal, suffer, and love, letting those scenes touch his own decisions. He learned to examine his conscience not as an obsessed judge, but as a grateful child, seeking to notice where God had been present in the day. He learned to recognize consolation as a gift meant to strengthen love and service, not to inflate pride, and to recognize desolation as a trial that should not be obeyed, but endured with trust. He learned to make choices by weighing their inner fruits, asking which path leads to greater faith, hope, and charity. None of this came as a tidy theory. It came as a lived knowledge, learned under the river's sudden light. There is also something tender in the way God gave this illumination to him. Inigo was still planning to go to Jerusalem. He still carried the pilgrim's longing to stand where Christ had stood, to give his life there in some hidden service. But God was beginning to show him that pilgrimage is not only a matter of distance, it is a matter of direction. The true Holy Land is wherever Christ asks the soul to meet him. The river gift did not erase Inigo's desire for Jerusalem. It purified it. It lifted it out of romantic idealism and set it within obedience. He began to sense that God's call might be larger than his own plans, larger even than the imaginations that had once driven him toward courtly glory, now redirected toward saintly adventure. Inigo's imagination had been converted, but God was still teaching him that even converted imagination must bow to the Lord's actual will. In the months after Cardinal, this new clarity grew steadier. He found himself able to counsel others who came seeking advice. People in Manresa noticed the change in him, the calm in his manner, the quiet authority of his spiritual insight. He did not place himself forward as a teacher. He was still a beggar, still a pilgrim, still a man who believed he was only beginning. Yet the grace in him naturally overflowed. He listened to troubled consciences with patience because he had been troubled himself. He guided others away from scruple because he knew its cruelty. He encouraged trust in God because trust had been his rescue, and as he spoke, the small notes he had been gathering in his heart became more ordered. Again, the seeds were growing. Still, he remained a man with a history. At times, the old fire of intensity would flare, and he would need to recall that God's way is often quiet. At times, he would feel again the ache of ambition, now not for a worldly name but for spiritual heroism. Yet the Cardinal light helped him hold those impulses with gentleness. He could see them, offer them, and let them pass. He could accept that God might lead him by steps rather than leaps. He could accept that suffering was not a mark of failure, but a place of meeting. He could accept that his limp, his weakness, his past, were not obstacles to holiness, but threads God had woven into his calling. When he thought back to Pamplona now, he could almost smile at the irony. Not a mocking smile, but a grateful one. The cannonball that had shattered his leg had opened a road to a river where God would open his mind. The ambition that had once demanded applause had become, through mercy, a desire to help souls find God. The soldier's thirst for decisive action had become a pilgrim's thirst for discernment. He did not know yet that future companions would gather around him, that universities and missions would rise from his labor, that the church would one day call him saint. He knew only that God had taken his life in hand and was teaching him to see. From that light, the shape of his future began to form, though still far away. From the future he sensed, his heart was pulled outward toward the lands of Christ, and the desire that had become clearer at the River Cardinal now pressed him to make his pilgrimage real, not only in spirit, but in distance. Inigo had lingered in Manresa far longer than he expected, nearly a year, and though the town had become a place of deep formation, he did not think of it as his destination. The Holy Land remained before him like a star. He had listened to the Gospels with a new intimacy, placing himself beside Jesus in prayer, and that nearness made him long to stand where Jesus had stood in the flesh. He imagined the hills of Galilee, the streets of Jerusalem, the Garden of Gethsemane. Somewhere in him, still shaped by the old chivalric instinct, there was a wish to offer his life at the very place where his Lord had offered his. Yet the wish was no longer romantic display. It had been washed by suffering. It was a longing to belong utterly to Christ, to live and perhaps die in the land that bore his footprints. So, with the blessing of those who knew him, he set out for Barcelona and then for the sea, trusting God to open the road one step at a time. The journey was slow and simple. He traveled as a poor pilgrim, begging when he needed to, sleeping in humble shelters, carrying little. The world of ships and ports was foreign to him. Yet he moved through it with the steady calm of someone who has learned to let go of control. In Barcelona he found passage to Rome, and then onward, and the sea crossing itself became another small school of humility. The ocean does not care about a man's plans. It moves at God's pace alone, and Inigo learned again to wait, to endure sickness, to accept uncertainty without turning inward in fear. When he reached Italy, he walked toward Rome, arriving with the quiet hope that the Church might bless his pilgrimage. Rome in those days was both dazzling and wounded, a city of saints' bones and human politics, a place where grandeur and fragility lived side by side. He prayed at the holy places, attended Mass, and placed his desire before God. He also sought counsel because the river light had taught him that good desires still need obedience. He was beginning to understand that a pilgrim does not simply choose a road and call it holy. A pilgrim walks where the Church confirms the call. From Rome he traveled to Venice, the launching point for many pilgrims toward the east. Venice was bustling, rich, filled with merchants, sailors, and languages he could not fully follow. Yet even there he remained simple, searching not for comfort but for a ship that would take him across the Mediterranean. He joined other pilgrims, some poor like him, some wealthy, all drawn by the same ancient longing. During the wait, he worked in a hospital, serving the sick, and there his conversion showed itself not in grand gestures, but in quiet charity. He cleaned wounds, carried water, comforted those who had no comfort, and he did so not to prove himself, but because Christ had become the center of his eyes. One can sense in these moments that his old warrior strength was being turned outward for mercy. He could still endure hardship, still move decisively, still give himself fully, but now the purpose was love. In the summer of 1523, a ship finally sailed, and Inigo boarded with a heart that felt both eager and tenderly cautious. The voyage itself was difficult. The sea was rough, provisions scarce, and the risk of pirates still real. Yet he bore it with the patience he had learned through pain and prayer. When the ship reached the coastline of Palestine, he stepped onto the soil with something like reverence mixed with awe. For years he had imagined this land as the pure stage of Christ's life. Now he stood there as a small, limping pilgrim, and the very smallness of his presence seemed right. He went first to Jerusalem, praying in the holy sites, letting the scriptures rise in his mind with new force as the physical places met the gospel scenes he had meditated on. He walked the streets where Jesus had walked, and if his heart shook, it was not with excitement alone, but with gratitude, as if God had brought him home to a mystery that could never be possessed, only adored. A part of him wanted to remain. He had hoped to stay in the Holy Land permanently, perhaps to live as a hermit near the holy places, perhaps to preach quietly to pilgrims, perhaps to serve in some hidden way that would allow his life to be poured out where Christ had poured his. He spoke to the Franciscan friars, who were custodians of the sacred sites, asking permission to remain. The friars listened kindly, but they also carried responsibilities larger than one pilgrim's zeal. The political situation was unstable. Christians who remained without oversight could face danger, and their presence could endanger the fragile agreements that allowed the friars to keep the holy places open. The superior told Inigo that he must return to Europe. Inigo heard the decision like a blow, not because he doubted its prudence, but because obedience sometimes cuts through the heart more sharply than any penance. He had dreamed of staying, of making this land his final offering. Now that dream was being asked back of him. Here the real fruit of his conversion showed itself. The Inigo of Pamplona, trained to insist on his own vision of honor, might have fought, argued, or defied authority. The Inigo of Manresa, taught by scruple and mercy, knew that holiness is not clinging to good desires when God closes the door. Holiness is letting go, even painfully, when the Church, in her wisdom, says no. He did not leave without sorrow. He walked the holy paths one more time, praying with tears that were quiet and honest. He asked Christ to receive his desire, even if the desire could not be fulfilled in the way he imagined. He asked Mary to teach him how to obey without bitterness. Then he boarded the ship back, carrying not a triumphant victory, but a humbled heart. The return voyage was marked by a different kind of silence. He had not failed. He had been obedient. Yet obedience can feel like emptiness at first, because it requires living without the comfort of one's own plan. Inigo looked at the sea, at the wide sky, and he let the emptiness be itself. Gradually, within that emptiness, another understanding began to rise. He realized that God had not called him to holiness only for his own soul. The light at Cardener, the discernment learned in Manresa, the charity practiced in Venice. These were not gifts meant to be buried in a hermit's solitude. They were meant to serve others. If the Holy Land was not his destination, perhaps it was because his mission lay elsewhere. He did not yet know where, but he began to sense that God was leading him toward something that required preparation, patience, and perhaps even studies. The soldier who once sought a personal name was being reshaped into a servant who would help other souls find God's name. When he returned to Europe, he was not bitter. He was quieter and more trusting. He had walked the place of Christ, and he had also walked the first deep lesson of apostolic obedience. His dream had been holy, but God had asked him to hand it back. He did. And in doing so, he found that the road of surrender, though painful, was the road that kept him closest to Christ. He returned with empty hands, yet perhaps God was preparing a different mission. That different mission began with books, classrooms, and the patience of slow formation. And for a man who had once measured life by the quick blaze of action, this new road demanded a quieter courage. When Inigo stepped back onto European soil after the Holy Land, he carried a heart that had learned to obey, yet he also carried a question that would not leave him. If he was not to remain in Jerusalem, then where was he to serve, and how? He had tasted, in Manresa and by the river Cardener, a way of prayer and discernment that could heal and guide souls, and already people had begun to seek his counsel. Yet he could feel, with the honesty that suffering had taught him, that zeal without grounding can become dangerous. He was not a priest. He had no formal education in theology. His language of faith was sincere but still young. If God wanted his life to serve others, he would need tools he did not yet have. The realization was humbling. He was in his 30s now, older than most students, with a limp and a past behind him. And yet he would have to sit again at the feet of teachers like a boy. Pride resisted at first, but grace had already begun to teach him that humility is not an ornament. It is the very doorway to God's work. So he turned toward study. He went first to Barcelona, not because it was grand, but because it was a place where he could begin. He enrolled in basic courses, learning Latin, the language of the church and of scholarship, a language he had not needed as a soldier. Imagine him there, a former courtier and captain sitting among younger students, sounding out declensions, practicing grammar, struggling to shape a tongue that was not his own. There were times he felt foolish. There were times he felt the impatience of a man who had lived through war and mystical struggle, now struggling with the slow, careful rules of a sentence. Yet he stayed. The same endurance that had carried him through Pamplona and Manresa now carried him through the quiet discipline of study. He learned to accept small beginnings. He learned that even the mind must be converted, not by sudden flashes, but by daily labor. As he studied, his instinct to help souls did not disappear. People came to him, drawn by his seriousness, his calm, and the way he spoke of prayer as something alive. He began to share with them the simple methods he had learned, guiding them in meditation on Christ's life, in examination of conscience, in noticing the movements of consolation and desolation. He did this naturally, as one shares bread with a hungry person, not as one performs a role. Yet this very activity began to cause trouble. Spain in those years was uneasy about new religious movements. The memory of heresies was fresh, and the Inquisition watched carefully. A layman who gathered people for spiritual conversation could be seen with suspicion, especially if he spoke with authority, without priestly credentials. Inigo did not set out to challenge anyone. He believed he was serving the church, but his zeal moved faster than the structures around him could easily understand. He traveled to Alcala to continue his studies and to live among the poor. There, too, he attracted followers, not by sudden charisma, but by steady guidance. He would speak to small groups, encourage confession, prayer, and a serious turning toward God. He avoided preaching in public as priests did, but he shared spiritual counsel in private homes and street corners. The effect on some was visible, and that visibility drew attention from authorities. Accusations came that he was teaching without permission, that he was part of a dangerous sect, that his methods were strange. Inigo was summoned, questioned, and eventually imprisoned for a time while his case was examined. It is striking to picture him in a cell again, not an enemy of the church, but a son caught in misunderstanding, his heart already given to obedience, and now asked to obey even when obedience meant being treated as suspect. His old self might have flared into outrage. He might have argued, defended his honor, or stormed out. But the Manresa lessons were deep in him now. He accepted the interrogation with calm. He explained his devotion plainly. He submitted his practices for review. He did not demand vindication. He trusted that truth would not need violence to survive. After weeks of investigation, he was released, cleared of heresy, though still advised not to teach until he had more education. He accepted that too. Yet obedience did not spare him from pain. Being misunderstood hurts more when your intentions are pure. Still, he did not let it harden him. He let it school him. He began to see that if he was to help souls widely, he must do so in a way that the church could recognize and support. That meant going deeper into study. He moved on to Salamanca, another university town, where he continued learning and again could not resist the quiet pull to guide those who came to him. The same cycle repeated. His gatherings drew attention. Authorities questioned him. He was imprisoned again for several weeks. The investigations found nothing heretical in him, only a layman with intense devotion and an unusual gift for spiritual direction. He was released again, but warned more strictly to stop public spiritual teaching until he was ordained or properly trained. For some, such repeated suspicions might have crushed the heart or sent them into bitterness against the church that seemed to doubt them. For Inigo, strangely, it strengthened a virtue that would later become central to his order, loyal obedience even under strain. He did not interpret these trials as a sign that his path was wrong. He interpreted them as a sign that God was asking him to be patient, to be formed fully, to learn the church from within rather than rushing ahead of her. There is also a gentler truth here. God was shaping in him not only knowledge but humility. The soldier in him still wanted to act quickly. The mystic in him still felt the urgency of souls in need. The repeated imprisonments were like a bridle on a strong horse, not to punish the horse, but to guide its strength into a road that would not collapse under it. Inigo began to understand that he was being prepared for a mission that would require not only zeal, but credibility, and not only credibility, but depth. His interior light had been great, but he would need to anchor that light in scripture, theology, and the careful reasoning of the Church. In other words, the fire of his heart needed a hearth. So he made a decision that seemed almost astonishing for a man of his background. If Spain could not yet accept his work, he would go elsewhere to study. He turned his eyes toward Paris, the greatest university city in Europe, a place where scholars from many lands gathered, where theology was taught with rigor, and where a man could be formed not only in piety, but in intellect. This meant leaving his homeland, leaving the familiar language and customs, leaving even the small groups who already looked to him for guidance. It meant starting over again, older, poorer, limping, and unknown. Yet by now he had learned that the road of God often feels like beginning again. He trusted the call. With a pilgrim's staff still in his spirit, he set out northward, crossing difficult roads, begging when necessary, driven not by the old hunger for fame, but by a new hunger to be useful for Christ. When he reached Paris in 1528, he entered a world even more demanding than Spain's universities. The city was crowded, cold, intellectually sharp, and socially stratified. He enrolled at the Collège de Montaigu and later the Collège de Sainte-Barbe, living in bare rooms, eating little, studying hard. He was mocked sometimes for his age, for his Basque accent, for his limp, for his poverty. Yet he kept going. He rose early, attended lectures, memorized texts, wrestled with Aristotle and the Fathers, learned to argue cases of theology, all while keeping a life of prayer under the surface. He was becoming, slowly and painfully, the kind of man who could serve not only by fervor, but by wisdom. By the end of these years, Inigo had endured a new kind of battlefield, the battlefield of patience, misunderstanding, and the slow shaping of the mind. He had learned to carry suspicion without resentment, to accept delay without despair, to submit his gifts to the Church's discernment, and to trust that God was not wasting his time. The pilgrim learned that truth grows best when watered by humility. In that soil of learning, God placed other hearts beside his, and the lonely pilgrim who had carried his conversion like a secret torch began to find companions who would one day carry the same fire into the world. Paris was not gentle to Inigo. The cold damp of its winters pressed into his bones, his poverty kept him close to hunger, and his studies demanded an effort that sometimes felt beyond his strength. Yet the very hardship that might have isolated him became the strange path by which others noticed him. He was older than many students, and there was a gravity in him that did not come from age alone, but from having been broken and rebuilt. He spoke little in public, but when he did speak, it was with a clarity that felt seasoned by prayer. His life was outwardly plain, almost severe, but there was a warmth beneath it, a steady kindness that made people trust him. Inigo did not come to Paris with a plan to found anything. He came to be formed. Yet God often builds great works not through grand intentions, but through faithful presence. And so friendships began to grow around him like vines finding a trellis. The first and perhaps most gentle of these friendships was with Peter Faber, a Savoyard student whose temperament was thoughtful, quiet, and deeply sincere. Faber shared a room with Inigo at Sainte Barbe, and in the close quarters of poverty, one cannot hide one's soul for long. Faber watched Inigo pray, watched his steady discipline, watched the way he carried hardship without bitterness, and he began to sense that this Basque man was not merely devout, but guided by something living. Inigo, for his part, saw in Faber a heart open to God, a man of learning who still longed for holiness beyond ideas. Their conversations were not sensational. They were the kind of slow, honest talk that grows in late evenings when two roommates speak of their hopes, fears, and the question of how to follow Christ in a world that offers so many false roads. Inigo did not rush Faber. He had learned too much about patience to do that. He listened, he asked questions, he shared his own story not to impress, but to witness to grace. Little by little, Faber's heart leaned toward the pilgrim's vision, the desire to find God in all things, to live not for oneself, but for the greater glory of Christ. Soon another figure entered their circle, Francis Xavier, a young nobleman from Navarre, brilliant, ambitious, and restless in a way that mirrored Inigo's own youth. Xavier had come to Paris to build a career. He wanted distinction, academic success, perhaps ecclesiastical advancement, the kind of path that would secure a name. He was charming, competitive, full of energy, and at first he had little interest in the intense Basque who spoke of poverty and pilgrimage. If anything, Inigo's presence irritated him. It reminded him of the claims of God that he was not yet ready to take seriously. Yet Inigo saw past the surface. He recognized in Xavier not a rival, but a soul shaped by the same hunger he once carried. And he loved him with the quiet persistence of someone who knows how God can turn hunger into holiness. He began to befriend Xavier in small ways, not by argument but by companionship. He offered help in studies, shared meals when he had any to share, walked with him, listened to him. When the moment was right, he spoke a single line that would echo in Xavier's mind for years. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? He did not preach it loudly. He spoke it as a question asked in friendship, and then he waited. Xavier resisted. He joked, he changed the subject, but the line stayed like a pebble in the shoe, small but impossible to ignore. As the years passed, other students drew near. James Lainez, Alfonso Salmeron, Nicolas de Bobadilla, Simon Rodriguez, men of different backgrounds but each touched by something they saw in Inigo, a steady blend of deep prayer and practical courage. Inigo began to gather them not as a leader collecting followers, but as a brother recognizing other brothers. His room became a small hearth where hearts warmed. He shared with them the methods of prayer he had been shaping since Manresa, guiding them through meditations on Christ, through examinations of conscience, through the discernment of spirits. These conversations were not formal lectures. They were invitations. Inigo would ask them to imagine the life of Jesus as if they were present, to notice how certain desires led toward generosity and others toward self-seeking, to place their life decisions under the light of God. What he offered was not a new doctrine. It was a way of listening to the gospel so closely that it began to shape the will. The men who entered this process often found themselves changed in ways they had not anticipated. Faber, the gentle Savoyard, gradually gave himself entirely to Christ. Xavier, the ambitious Navarrese, fought longer, but even his resistance was a form of engagement, until one day it yielded into surrender. The others, each in their own rhythm, felt the same pull toward a life not centered on personal advancement, but on apostolic service. It is worth pausing here in the quiet way your soul understands. God did not gather these men because they were perfect, or because they already agreed on every point of life. He gathered them because each carried a desire that could be purified into mission. Inigo's gift was to trust that desire and to guide it patiently. He did not demand that his companions become copies of him. He wanted them to become men deeply united to Christ, and then to let Christ use their distinct strengths. This was already the seed of the Jesuit spirit: unity without uniformity, obedience without erasing personality, a shared mission carried by many kinds of hearts. By 1534, the group was ready to make a concrete commitment. They were not yet an order. They were not even sure what form their future would take. But they knew they belonged to something God was shaping among them. On the Feast of the Assumption, August 15th, they went to a small chapel on the hill of Montmartre in Paris. There, with Peter Faber, now ordained, presiding over Mass, they received the Eucharist together and made vows of poverty and chastity, promising to go to the Holy Land to preach and serve, and if that was impossible, to place themselves at the disposal of the Pope for whatever mission he judged best. It was a simple ceremony in a humble chapel, far from the grandeur of cathedrals or royal courts, and yet it carried a gravity like the first beat of a new heart. Inigo, who had once laid his sword before Mary at Montserrat, now laid his future before Christ with companions beside him. He was no longer a lone pilgrim. He was part of a brotherhood forged not by bloodline or nationality, but by shared surrender. After that day, they returned to their studies, because they still needed formation, and because the vows they had made were not an escape from work, but a deeper entrance into it. Yet everything had changed in its meaning. Their books, their lectures, their debates, their daily hardships were now preparation for mission. Inigo guided them to keep cultivating prayer amid scholarship, to stay rooted in the sacraments, to live charity among themselves. There were still moments of tension, differences of temperament, questions about the future, but a quiet thread of unity held them, the conviction that God had brought them together for a purpose larger than any one of them could see. In those Paris years, the pilgrim's interior light found human faces to reflect it, and the small circle that formed around him was still almost invisible to the world. Yet the world doesn't always feel the beginning of what will later reshape it. Their small circle felt ordinary, yet the world would soon feel its echo. The echo grew louder as their feet carried them toward the heart of the church, and the vows at Montmartre, once spoken in a small chapel, began to unfold into a journey that would test their unity and reveal the shape of their calling. After their Paris years, the companions scattered briefly to complete studies and prepare for ordination, not as men chasing careers, but as pilgrims gathering strength for service. Inigo himself, now more often called Ignatius, returned to Spain for a short time to settle practical matters and to rest his health, which had suffered in the long seasons of poverty and strain. Yet even rest did not quiet the movement inside him. He felt the group's mission like a living promise, something greater than any private devotion. When the agreed time came, they began to converge again, aiming for Venice, the port from which they hoped to sail to the Holy Land. Their desire was still the same as it had been at Montmartre, to go where Christ had walked, to preach there quietly, to offer themselves among the people of that land. But now their desire had matured. It was no longer a personal dream of heroism. It was a shared willingness to be sent, a willingness already tempered by Ignatius's own painful lesson in obedience. The road to Venice was long, and it was not without hardship. Europe was uneasy, and travel was uncertain. They walked or rode in small groups, relying on alms, sleeping where they could, praying along the way, sometimes separated by distances and time, yet held together by the same interior compass. When they reached Venice in 1537, they found the city already crowded with news of war. Conflict between the Venetian forces and the Ottoman Empire made traveling to Jerusalem impossible. Ships that might have carried pilgrims were redirected to military needs, and the sea itself had become too dangerous for an unprotected mission. The outward door to the Holy Land was closed, again, but this time not to one pilgrim alone. It was closed to a brotherhood. The companions felt sorrow, but they also remembered the second part of their vows. If Jerusalem was not possible, they would make their way to Rome and place themselves in the hands of the Pope. Their mission was not a map they carried in their own pockets. It was a readiness to go wherever the Church needed them most. Before leaving Venice, the companions took another step in their formation. Several were ordained priests there during that year, including Ignatius, though he chose to delay celebrating his first Mass until he felt more prepared interiorly. There is a quiet humility in that choice. Ordination could have been a moment of personal pride, a public victory after years of poverty and suspicion. But Ignatius held it with the reverence of a man who knew that priesthood is not a reward, but a trembling service. He spent time in prayer, making retreat, asking Mary to place him more deeply in her Son's hands, and asking Christ to purify every corner of his intention. His first Mass, when it finally came months later in Rome, would be marked by tears not of sadness, but of an awe so tender that the heart could not hold it silently. The group's journey from Venice to Rome became a kind of living parable. They traveled as priests now, but still as poor pilgrims, begging for food, wearing simple clothes, speaking of Christ to those who met them on the road. They were not yet called Jesuits. They did not yet know whether they would remain together permanently. Yet they felt themselves to be, in a deep sense, one body. Along the way they experienced moments that strengthened this sense, including a significant time near the town of La Storta, outside Rome. There, as Ignatius prayed in a small chapel, he felt a powerful inner confirmation, a sense of the Father placing him with the Son who carried the cross, and of Christ saying, in effect, that he would be favorable to them in Rome. Ignatius did not treat this as a private privilege. He received it as a promise for the whole group, as if the Lord were saying, "Yes, come forward, your path is here." It was one more gentle beam of light added to the pilgrim road. When they entered Rome, the city again seemed full of contradictions, holiness and politics, grandeur and human frailty. Yet Rome was also the beating heart of the Church, and to offer themselves there was to offer themselves at the very center of Catholic life. They presented their vows and their intention to Pope Paul III. The Pope listened attentively. He had already heard of these men, their seriousness, their learning, their desire to serve without seeking privilege. The companions asked to be sent wherever the need was greatest. At first, their plan remained simple. They were a group of priests willing to serve. Yet as they stayed in Rome and began to take on small missions, something became clear to both them and the Pope. Their unity was not accidental. Their methods of prayer and discernment were bearing fruit. Their willingness to go anywhere, combined with their education and their interior discipline, made them uniquely suited to the Church's urgent needs in a changing world. Europe was trembling under the pressures of reform and division. New lands were opening across oceans. Cities were hungry for education and preaching. The Church needed men who could move quickly, think clearly, live obediently, and kindle faith without seeking personal glory. The companions seemed shaped for precisely that, yet a new question rose among them. Should they remain simply a loose band of priests, or should they become a stable body with a defined rule, so that their mission could endure beyond their individual lives? They prayed, discussed, and listened to God together. Unity had been their strength. But unity without structure can fade when trials come. Ignatius, whose gift for discernment had grown through pain, guided this reflection with calm wisdom. He did not want an order for its own sake. He wanted whatever would serve Christ's mission best. Gradually, the companions agreed that God was calling them to form a religious society, bound by vows, with a special obedience to the Pope for missions. They chose to place their shared life under the name Society of Jesus, because they wanted Jesus himself to be their standard and their leader, not any human title that might draw attention to themselves. They drafted a brief formula describing their purpose: to serve the Lord alone and the Church his bride, to live in poverty and chastity, to be ready for any mission, and to help souls through preaching, confession, spiritual direction, and education. They submitted this formula to the Pope. Paul III examined it carefully, consulting theologians, weighing the climate of the time. There was some hesitation in Rome about founding new orders. The Church had learned caution. Yet the Pope recognized both their orthodoxy and their distinctive usefulness. In September 1540, he approved the Society of Jesus by papal bull. What had begun as a broken soldier's conversion and a few friendships in Paris was now, officially, a new order of the Church. Ignatius did not receive this approval as a triumph of his own planning. He received it with a mixture of gratitude and holy fear. Approval meant responsibility. It meant that their lives were now publicly tied to a mission that could stretch to the ends of the earth. It meant saying yes to a path whose demands could not yet be measured. Soon after, the companions elected Ignatius as their first superior general. He resisted at first, knowing his weaknesses, still feeling his limp, still sensing the scars of scruple and suffering in his memory. But obedience asked him to accept leadership, and so he did. Not like a man climbing into power, but like a servant kneeling into burden. In those days, Rome watched quietly as the new society took its first sure breaths. They were few. They had no wealth. They had only a common rule of life, a burning readiness to be sent, and a leader whose heart had been forged in pain and mercy. A new order was born from a wounded soldier and a handful of friends. Birth is only the beginning, and now the work of guiding began. A work that would unfold not in the thunder of public spectacle, but in the steady, hidden labor of a man who had learned to lead by prayer and by love. When Ignatius accepted the role of superior general of the Society of Jesus, he did not suddenly become a different sort of person. The soldier's intensity, the pilgrim's humility, the mystic's clarity, and the student's discipline all remained in him. But now they had to be poured into a life that was no longer his alone. He was responsible for a growing body of men who had pledged themselves to Christ and to the Church under his guidance. The society was small at first, fragile in the world's eyes, and rather strange to many. They were priests who did not chant the divine office in choir like monks, men who lived in the world, moving quickly from place to place, bound together not by a single monastery, but by a mission. Their very flexibility was their strength, but it also required a firm inner center. Otherwise, the order could become scattered smoke instead of a steady flame. Ignatius understood this. The same discernment that had once saved him from scruple now was needed to shape a whole way of life. He set himself to writing the constitutions, the guiding rule that would hold the society together across countries and generations. He did not write them as a theoretician far from daily realities. He wrote them in the midst of those realities, revising them slowly, weighing each line in prayer, asking how a rule could protect the interior freedom necessary for mission, while still anchoring that freedom in obedience. He was careful about human weakness because he had known his own. He was realistic about temptation because he had fought it in his heart. The constitutions, then, were not a cage. They were a path, designed to help Jesuits become men who could find God in all things and serve wherever they were sent. He insisted on a deep interior life, on daily examination of conscience, on prayer that listens as well as speaks, on frequent reception of the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, which he loved as the quiet center of the Church's life. He insisted on poverty not as a romantic gesture, but as the practical freedom that keeps a missionary unburdened. He insisted on chastity because he knew how easily the heart can be divided. And above all, he insisted on obedience, not a blind obedience that crushes personality, but a discerning obedience that places personal gifts at the service of Christ's will. His own life was the proof that obedience can be a road to joy. While he wrote, the society was already moving. Requests for Jesuits arrived from bishops, princes, and the Pope himself. Ignatius did not send men carelessly. He prayed over each assignment as if he were placing a brother on the altar. He listened to their strengths, their weaknesses, their temperaments, and he tried to match each to a mission where their gifts would bear fruit. It was a delicate work, half strategy and half spiritual fatherhood. Francis Xavier was among the first to be sent far away. When the King of Portugal asked for missionaries to serve in the East Indies, Ignatius saw the call as unmistakably providential. He sent Xavier, who had once resisted conversion with clever pride, now ready to pour himself out for souls he had never met. Xavier left Rome almost at once, sailing toward India and beyond, carrying not only his own zeal, but the Society's very first breath of global mission. Ignatius watched him go with a father's mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing that mission means separation, and that separation must be born for love. Letters began to flow between them, Xavier describing new lands, new languages, baptisms, hardships, and deaths, Ignatius replying with encouragement, counsel, and a steady reminder to remain rooted in prayer. These letters would become one of Ignatius's main tools of leadership. From Rome, he governed the society largely through correspondence, sending thousands of letters across Europe and into distant worlds, letters filled with practical instruction, spiritual wisdom, careful affection, and a clear desire that every Jesuit remain united to Christ. The missions multiplied rapidly. Jesuits went to Germany and the Low Countries, where reform and division had torn the Church's fabric, to preach, teach, and quietly rebuild faith through learning and pastoral care. Others went to Ireland and England, where Catholic life was endangered, to serve at risk of their lives. Some went to the Americas, following the Spanish and Portuguese expansions, trying to defend the dignity of indigenous peoples while preaching the gospel. Others stayed in cities of Europe to establish schools. Ignatius had a profound sense that education was a long kind of mission, a way of shaping minds and hearts for generations. He supported the founding of colleges not as centers of elite privilege, but as places where truth and faith could meet without fear. The Jesuit schools quickly gained a reputation for rigorous learning and a careful formation of character. Ignatius saw this not as a side project, but as a direct apostolic work, because a mind trained to seek truth is a mind more able to receive God. From his small room in Rome, Ignatius carried an immense burden. His health was never strong after Manresa and years of strain. He suffered chronic stomach pain, weakness, and the lingering limitations of his old war wound. Yet he worked with a quiet relentlessness. He rose early, prayed, attended Mass, met with Jesuits and church officials, reviewed reports, revised the constitutions, wrote letters, and listened to the needs that came to his door like waves. The pace would have crushed a weaker soul. What kept him steady was not natural stamina alone. It was the interior habit of finding God in each task. He had learned to treat even administration as prayer, not by wrapping it in pious words, but by offering each decision to Christ, asking which choice would lead to the greater glory of God and the good of souls. Leadership also required him to face conflicts. Not all Jesuits agreed on every method. Some were too harsh, others too lax. Some wanted more structure, others more freedom. Ignatius held the center patiently, correcting when needed, encouraging when possible, always returning to discernment rather than impulse. He was firm without being brittle. He could be demanding because he believed the mission mattered, but his demands were shaped by fatherly care rather than ego. In moments of tension, one can glimpse the transformed soldier in him. His strength was still iron, but now the iron was tempered by mercy. Through it all, Ignatius remained deeply Marian. His earliest surrender at Montserrat had placed him under Mary's mantle, and he never left that shelter. He encouraged Jesuits to pray to her, to trust her guidance, and to imitate her humility. For him, Mary was not a soft ornament to faith. She was a living mother who teaches the soul how to say yes to God's invitation, even when the invitation pierces the heart. In the same way, he remained centered on the cross. He did not seek suffering for its own sake, but he did not fear it. He had known that a life devoted to Christ would be misunderstood, opposed, and tested. He taught his companions to expect this not with bitterness, but with readiness, because the cross is the shape love takes in a world that resists love. As the years passed, the society grew from a handful to hundreds, then to thousands. Yet Ignatius did not measure success by numbers. He measured it by fidelity, by whether Jesuits were becoming men of prayer, discernment, and generous service. When he heard of a college flourishing or a mission bearing fruit, he thanked God. When he heard of a Jesuit faltering through pride or confusion, he did not condemn. He guided. The man who had once nearly drowned in scruple knew how fragile a soul can be. His leadership was, in that sense, a long extension of his own conversion, taking the lessons learned in darkness and offering them to others as light. And so, the former Basque captain spent his middle years not in the spotlight of armies or courts, but in the hidden warfare of spiritual fatherhood, shaping an order that would travel farther than his own feet ever could. The man who once sought his own name now poured himself out so Christ might be known. As the order grew, his own body slowly faded, and Ignatius, who had once limped out of Loyola with a pilgrim's staff and a heart on fire, now found himself moving more and more within the narrow corridors of his Roman rooms, carrying a mission that had expanded beyond anything he had imagined, while his strength quietly diminished. The years of leadership had been fruitful, but they had also cost him. His stomach ailments, which had troubled him for decades, became sharper and more frequent. He endured fevers, weakness, and bouts of pain that could leave him exhausted for hours. The old war wound still made itself known in cold weather or long days, and the limp that had once humiliated him now seemed almost like a companion, a reminder that the foundation of the society was not brilliance or power, but a body once shattered and then offered to God. He did not speak often of his sufferings. He had never been a man who liked to draw attention to himself, and conversion had deepened that humility. Yet those who lived near him could see that he carried a continual interior and physical strain. The work remained immense. Letters still had to be written, missions still needed discernment, colleges still required guidance, bishops and nobles still came to Rome seeking Jesuit help, and the constitutions were still being refined line by line. Ignatius did not withdraw from the burden. He adjusted his pace, but he did not abandon his post. What had once been a soldier's endurance was now a father's perseverance, steady, quiet, and poured out day after day. In these later years, his prayer life became even more interior. He had always been a man of long devotion, but age and weakness drew him into a deeper simplicity. He no longer needed the fierce penances of Manresa to prove love. Love had become its own proof. He prayed in short bursts throughout the day, lifting his mind to God between meetings, before decisions, after letters, during pain. This habit, sometimes called contemplation in action, was not a technique to him, but a way of breathing. He lived as if God were present in every minute, because he had learned that God truly is. The Eucharist remained the center. Even when his body felt thin and tired, he went to Mass whenever he could, and when he could not, he asked for it to be brought to him. He spoke of the Blessed Sacrament not with dramatic language, but with a tenderness that revealed where his heart rested. In the host he saw the same Christ who had met him in books at Loyola, who had guided him through scruples at Manresa, who had widened his mind at Cardinal, who had gathered companions in Paris, and who had carried the society into the world. To receive that Christ was to begin again each day, even in old age. He also kept a quiet devotion to Mary, turning to her in the small hours of pain, asking her to teach him how to persevere in trust. His relationship with her had matured from the chivalric gesture of Montserrat into a steady filial confidence. He did not need to imagine her. He simply leaned on her. The constitutions occupied much of his final energy. He revised them slowly, reading them aloud to himself, praying over each phrase, asking whether it would truly help future Jesuits remain free for mission and faithful to Christ. He knew he would not live forever, and that the society would soon be in other hands. A lesser leader might have tried to secure power through rigid control. Ignatius did the opposite. He tried to secure freedom through clear spiritual foundations. He wrote about the care of souls, the balance of prayer and study, the importance of moderation in penance, the need for good formation before mission, and the role of obedience as a path to Christ's own obedience to the Father. He did not idealize human nature. He knew its sharp edges. Yet he trusted grace more than he feared weakness. His rule was realistic because it was merciful. When the constitutions were close to completion, he felt not pride but relief, as a father might feel after building a house sturdy enough to shelter children he will not always be able to protect personally. Though his sight of the society's growth brought joy, it also brought a kind of hidden sorrow, the sorrow of distance. His companions were scattered across continents. Some he would never see again. News came from far away as thin lines in letters, sometimes joyous with conversions and schools thriving, sometimes tragic with illness, martyrdom, or mission failures. Ignatius held all of it before God. When a Jesuit died on mission, he grieved quietly, then thanked Christ for the offering. When a mission struggled or a community quarreled, he counseled patience and charity. He did not panic. He had learned at the edge of the river in Manresa that God guides his work even through darkness. Yet the Father's heart in him felt every loss. The man who once craved admiration now carried the weight of beloved sons serving out of sight. This is one of the more tender transformations in his story. His greatness no longer depended on triumph. It depended on love that could let others be sent beyond him. He also continued to face opposition, though in a quieter form. The society's rapid spread stirred suspicion in some quarters. A few clergy feared Jesuit influence, others questioned their mobility or their educational methods. Some criticized their direct obedience to the Pope, viewing it as too centralized. Ignatius responded not with anger, but with clarity, explaining their purpose, submitting to church authority, correcting his own men when they were at fault, and trusting that time and fidelity would prove the society's spirit. He had already lived through imprisonment and investigation as a layman. He knew the taste of misunderstanding. It did not surprise him now. If anything, it confirmed that the cross remains part of every apostolic road. He taught his Jesuits to answer criticism with humility and service, to let their lives speak louder than their defenses. This was not weakness. It was a deliberate imitation of Christ, who answered accusation not by striking back, but by loving to the end. As his health worsened, Ignatius became more aware of his own approaching death. He did not fear it in a dramatic way. He had walked too long with suffering to be shocked by mortality. Yet he treated death the way he treated every other threshold, with discernment, preparation, and surrender. He reviewed his conscience gently, not with scruple, but with gratitude for mercy. He renewed his vows privately, placing them again in the hands of Christ. He entrusted the society to God and to the men who would carry it forward. He also accepted help more readily. For a man who had once insisted on controlling his body's healing by demanding harsh surgeries, this acceptance was itself a final conversion, letting others serve him without feeling diminished. He learned to be cared for as he had cared for others. He learned again that love is not only giving, it is receiving with humility. There were mornings when pain made him slow to rise, afternoons when exhaustion blurred his vision, nights when he could not sleep and simply lay in silence, offering the hours. In those nights he may have remembered Loyola, Pamplona, Montserrat, Manresa, Paris, and the countless faces of souls he had guided. But memory in old age is not always restless. Sometimes it is a quiet weaving of thanksgiving. He could see the strange mercy that had led him, a mercy that broke him where he needed breaking and strengthened him where he needed strengthening. He could see that his life, once obsessed with a personal story of glory, had become a living lesson that God's glory is most often revealed through surrender. His final years were not a retreat from mission. They were mission refined into offering, the offering of weakness, patience, and trust. The flame that once blazed in penance now warmed in endurance, and so, even as his body faded, his interior life grew more still and more luminous, like a lamp burning quietly near dawn. His life was becoming the final offering he had learned to make each day. The offering of his life reached its stillest moment in the summer of 1556, when Rome was warm and bright and full of its usual movement, and yet inside Ignatius's small rooms, the world was narrowing toward a quiet threshold. He had been ill for some time, but the decline in those last weeks became unmistakable. His stomach pains, long carried like an old companion, grew sharper. His strength slipped in small daily measures, as if God were gently loosening his grip on earth. He continued to work as long as he could, still reading letters, still giving counsel, still asking after missions with a father's concern. But now the effort cost him dearly. Those who lived near him could see that he was moving through the hours on a thin thread of endurance, and they tried to persuade him to rest more. He did rest more, but even his rest was prayer. When he lay back, he was not escaping the mission. He was offering it. He had learned that surrender is not abandonment. It is a deeper kind of service when the body can no longer act. In these final days, he did not gather his companions for a dramatic farewell. He was not a man of staged endings. The Society of Jesus had never been built on his personality, and he did not want it to depend on a sentimental memory of his last words. Instead, he treated death as he had treated every other decision, with quiet discernment and trust. He asked for the sacraments with the simple reverence of a faithful son of the Church. He received confession and the Eucharist, and those who saw him afterward noticed how his face softened with peace, as if he were being carried by the very mercy that had rescued him at Manresa long before. He spoke little, but when he did speak, it was gentle and practical, giving small instructions, asking that the constitutions be respected, reminding his brothers to remain united to Christ and obedient to the Church. There was no fear in his manner. If anything, there was a kind of calm attentiveness, the way a traveler looks at the road when he knows he is nearing home. Early on the morning of July 31st, he felt his end approaching. He asked for his close companions, and he asked specifically for a priest to be with him. There was a brief delay, because Rome does not always move quickly, even in sacred matters, and ignorance of the urgency cost a few minutes. Yet Ignatius did not grow anxious. He had waited so many times in his life, on a battlefield wall, in a sick bed, on roads of uncertainty, in the slow years of study and suspicion, that waiting had become a form of trust. He lay quietly, breathing shallowly. Then, almost without outward struggle, he slipped into death. The moment was simple. There was no thunder. There was no final dramatic sentence recorded for history. A man who had once been a noisy seeker of fame died in the silence of a small room, and the room itself seemed to hold that silence like a prayer. His companions wept, not only because they loved him, but because they could feel that a father had gone from their sight. Yet their grief was not hopeless. They had learned from him that the work was God's, and that when one servant is called home, God raises others to carry the same mission. News of his death spread quickly through Rome and beyond. Jesuits in the city gathered for his funeral mass, and soon letters went outward across Europe and across the seas, reaching men who were preaching in German towns, teaching in new colleges, traveling through forests in the Americas, or struggling with languages in India and Japan. Many of them had never seen Ignatius for years. Some had never met him at all, and yet they felt his presence in every line of his letters, every shaping of their rule, every way of praying that helped them rise from discouragement to courage. Their father was gone, but his spirit remained woven into their daily life. The society did not crumble, it steadied. The constitutions provided a backbone, the spiritual exercises provided a heart, and the vow of mission provided wings. Within a few decades, the Jesuits would be at the center of Catholic renewal, educating generations, advising the poor and the powerful, defending the faith against distortion, and bringing the gospel into places where Christ's name had never been spoken before. Ignatius's influence did not rest only in what the Jesuits did outwardly. It rested also in what he had given the Church inwardly. The spiritual exercises, born from his long nights in Manresa and his illumination by the Cardinal, became a gift offered far beyond the society. Priests, religious, and laypeople found in them a way to pray that is both simple and deep, a way to meet Christ personally through the gospel, a way to discern God's call amid the noise of desire and fear. The exercises taught souls to notice where consolation leads to generosity, and where desolation tempts toward shrinking and despair. They taught that God is not far away, but present and active in every corner of life. They taught that a person can make decisions not by impulse or vanity, but by listening to the Spirit. In a church often tempted to live by routine, Ignatius offered a living method of interior attention. His own conversion became a road for countless others. His legacy also unfolded in education. The Jesuit colleges Ignatius encouraged grew into a vast network that shaped Catholic intellectual life for centuries. They trained not only clergy, but statesmen, scientists, artists, and ordinary students, teaching them to seek truth with rigor and to keep faith as a companion to reason rather than an enemy of it. In a world that was changing rapidly, his insistence on educated mission helped the Church meet new questions without fear. In mission lands, Jesuits often became bridges between cultures, learning languages, respecting local customs, defending indigenous dignity when they could, and offering the gospel not as a foreign weapon, but as a universal hope. Their successes were uneven, because every human work is uneven, but the impulse behind them came from Ignatius's own transformed heart, the heart of a soldier who learned to battle not against people, but against everything that keeps a soul from God. Over time, the Church recognized what his companions had already known. The man once suspected and imprisoned as a spiritual troublemaker was in truth a saint of discernment and apostolic zeal. He was beatified in 1609 and canonized in 1622, not because he had lived without intensity or struggle, but because his intensity had been surrendered and purified into love. His feast day continues to draw the faithful to prayer, to the sacraments, and to that quiet question he learned to ask with his whole life, what leads me closer to Christ? If you step back and look gently at the long arc, you see the paradox that runs through him like a thread. God did not erase the soldier. He converted him. He took the iron will, the courage, the longing for greatness, and turned them toward a masterpiece of service. The cannonball that shattered his leg did not ruin his destiny. It opened it. The scruples that nearly drove him to despair did not destroy his faith. They taught him mercy. The obedience that forced him away from Jerusalem did not waste his desire. It redirected it into a mission that reached farther than his own dreams. Everything in his life, even what seemed broken, became material for grace. And so, in the hush after his passing, we see how God can turn a wounded ambition into a light for generations, inviting each of us to ask softly where our own true battle lies.